Good morning. I'm going to begin by reading from the lectionary text for today, the gospel reading from the book of Matthew, chapter 14, verses 22 through 33. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he sent the multitudes away. And when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Now when evening came, he was alone there. But the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. Now in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them, walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It is a ghost," and they cried out for fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Be of good cheer, it is I, do not be afraid." And Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." So he said, "Come." And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him, and said to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Then those who were in the boat came and worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Now we're going to cut away to a song that David Fox recorded for us. And after David finishes the song, I will be back with a little devotional on this scripture passage. So now here's David.
Bless the Lord, oh my soul, oh my soul, worship his holy name. Sing like never before, oh my soul, I'll worship your holy name. The sun comes up, it's a new day dawning. It's time to sing your song again. Whatever may pass and whatever lies before me, let me be singing when the evening comes. Bless the Lord, oh my soul, oh my soul, worship his holy name. 10,000 years and then forevermore. Bless the Lord, oh my soul, oh my soul. Worship his holy name. Sing like never before, oh my soul. I'll worship your holy name. I will worship your holy name.
Okay, now let's take a look at this scripture passage that I just read. And before I begin, I will say this has to be one of the richest stories in all of the Gospels. And a story like this deserves a lot more than a brief devotional. So I can only encourage you to study this story and follow some of the leads that I'm going to throw out for you. The first thing I noticed is that this story is connected to the feeding of the 5,000 or the feeding of the multitude. And in fact, 3 of the 4 gospel writers tell this story, and each of those writers has this story coming immediately after the feeding of the multitude. Also notice that in this story, Jesus rather abruptly sends his disciples away to get in the boat. If you remember the feeding of the 5,000, you know that the child had a few pieces of fish and a few biscuits, and yet Jesus miraculously fed the entire crowd with that small amount of food, and the disciples picked up 12 baskets full after that was over. So it seems rather abrupt that Jesus just turned to them about that time and said, you need to get on the boat and get over to the other side of the lake, and don't worry about me, I'll meet you there. Third thing that I notice about this is just the rather startling fact that Jesus himself didn't go with the disciples. In fact, I believe this is the first time in the book of Matthew when Jesus does not go somewhere but sends the disciples out by themselves. Another thing I noticed about the story is that the disciples must have taken their time trying to get to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. The sea is only 4.5 miles wide at that point, and yet we see in the story that it took them all night long to row across. That seems like awfully slow going. All right, the next thing that I see here is that Jesus sent his disciples out on what might be considered by them a pretty dangerous adventure. Keep in mind that the Jewish people were not a seafaring people. Many of the other ancient cultures sent boats and ships all over their part of the world, or even away from their part of the world, doing all kinds of discovery. But the Jews were not a seafaring people, and in fact, they didn't care much for large open bodies of water. Rivers were good, wells were good, seas and big lakes, not so good. The next thing we notice is that when they saw Jesus, he told them not to be afraid. And you know, in a way, that should almost have been the end of the story. And in fact, in the other Gospels, the story leaves out the whole part about Peter trying to walk on the water. And Jesus, by reassuring the disciples, just gets them across the water. In the book of Mark, an extra little detail is added to the story here. It says that when Jesus came out walking on the water, he was going to pass right by them. Maybe he didn't even think it was necessary to stop. He was just going across the lake by a different method. But when he saw them, he was assured that they were going to be okay, that they could get across the lake, and he was just going to walk on by until they saw him. All right, the next part of the story concerns Peter. Peter, seeing Jesus walking on the water, or someone walking on the water, decided to put the whole situation to a test. And he said, Jesus, if it is you, then you command me to come walking out toward you on the water. Jesus complied with his request. It doesn't say anywhere in the story that it was Jesus's idea for Peter to walk on the water or that he wanted him to get out of the boat, but he just sort of went along with Peter's request. So Peter got out of the boat, and as soon as he did, he saw just how bad it was outside the boat. It was much worse than he thought it was, and he began to be afraid and started to sink. And then, of course, you know the rest of the story. Jesus reached out, rescued him, and then Jesus and Peter got back in the boat, and the wind was calmed. So there are a lot of things to notice about this story, but in order to give you a couple of ideas that you can take away with you, I have tried to condense it to a couple of good lessons. The first thing I want you to think about is that this is an illustration of how the most amazing and blessed experiences that we can have are sometimes followed by the most severe trials and hardships. That feeding of the 5,000 had to be one of the high points in the disciples' experience with Jesus. Seeing Jesus use that little bit of food and feed all those people and fill those hungry stomachs and make those people so happy that, according to the book of John, they wanted to make Jesus a king right there on the spot. That must have been an exhilarating, joyful experience for the disciples. But then Jesus sent them immediately away and sent them where they probably did not really want to go, into a boat out on the sea. Some interpreters see this story as a metaphor, and maybe this is a good way to look at it. The feeding episode represents Jesus in the flesh, those 3 years of his earthly ministry when the disciples had him beside them day by day, feeding them, teaching them, showing them the way to do ministry and the way to live. As he sent them away on their own, this could be a representation of the post-Easter church, the church living in the age where Jesus is no longer physically present with us. And I think that might be a valid way to interpret this story, that we see Jesus giving the disciples a foretaste, a warning, an indication that things were not always going to be like this, that the day was going to come when he would not be with them, that they would be out on their own. I think another useful interpretation of this is to say that this is a story that happens to each of us individually. I would think that almost any of us can look back at a time in life when we experienced something amazing, joyful, blessed, when we got to participate in a worship experience that just thrilled our heart, or we got to be a part of some joyful event in our family's life. And then just as we were enjoying that so much, something comes along and dashes us to the ground. Hardship and trial seem so often to follow on the heels of those glorious experiences. So one way of looking at that part of the story is to say that Jesus is going to be with us, even if we can't see him physically present with us. And that is the thing that he wants us to take assurance from, that he is always with us in the hardest times, in the most serious trials. Takeaway number 2, stay in the boat. Nowhere in the story does it tell us, as I said a moment ago, that Jesus wanted Peter to get out of the boat. That was Peter's idea. And what was his motive for wanting to get out of the boat? Well, for one thing, he said, Lord, if it is you, then prove it to me. Or maybe Peter had in mind that he could just do something that Jesus was doing just because he wanted to. It was his idea. But human beings can't walk on water. Human beings need to be on solid ground, or at least on something solid. And Jesus had told the disciples to get in the boat and go across the lake. And just because they saw Jesus getting across the lake by a different means of transportation doesn't mean that that order was taken back. Doesn't mean that the instructions were amended. Jesus did not intend for Peter to get out and try to do what only a divine person can do. So when Peter got out of the boat, he knew right away. I don't know how many steps he took. The story doesn't tell us, but I have a feeling he didn't take very many steps. He looked around and he said, this was a bad idea. And soon he was struggling to keep his head above the water. And of course, after he cried out, Jesus reached out, grabbed him, and helped him get back into the boat. Then Jesus said something interesting to him. He says, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" That mild rebuke that Jesus offered to Peter at that point causes some people to think that the point of this story is that, oh yes, you can walk on water if you just believe hard enough. You can do anything that Jesus does if you just believe hard enough. But that there's something a little bit wrong with that interpretation. I've never walked on water that I can remember, and I don't know if there's anybody else out there listening to me who can, but I have been in a boat, and I can go across the water as long as I stay in the boat. And I think Jesus might have been prodding Peter a little bit here, not for his lack of believing that he really could walk on the water, but for failing to believe in the boat. The word that Jesus used for doubt right here is not a word that means he questioned Jesus at all. In fact, the word that is used there does not really refer to questioning truth, but it refers to vacillating or getting off track. And so maybe what Jesus was saying to Peter and to the rest of the disciples, why didn't you do what I asked you to do? Why didn't you get in the boat when I sent you down to the shore? Why did it take you all night to cross 4.5 miles of this little lake? Why did you not stay on track? Jesus looks at us and he knows that in spite of the fact that we are redeemed, we are his children, we are his disciples, we are still human. He does not expect us to do things that only God can do, but he's given us a boat. I think it's cool that the inside of our sanctuary at First Christian Church looks like the inside of a boat. But God has given us a boat so that we can get across to the other side, and we don't have to try and get across the same way that Jesus gets across. We just need to follow the instructions that Jesus has given us and not get off the course. Thanks be to God.